Welcome to this, our fourth in a series of Earnscliffe's 2001 federal election webinars. My name is Alan Gregg, and as always, I'm joined by a number of my colleagues, all of whom have extensive experience in campaigns themselves. Before I get to them, I want to just tell those who have joined us that on the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. And you should feel free to pose a question either to an individual panelist or to the panel as a whole over the course of the conversation, and a couple times we will break to those, and Julie will pose them to either an individual or to the total group. Without further ado, the panelist this week is Dan Bernier. He heads up our practice in the province of Quebec. He was also a former chief of staff to Environmental Minister Rona Ambrose and a senior advisor to the Minister of International Trade during the North American Free Trade Agreement. Julie Gardner is a former senior staffer in Queen's Park to, I think, 5 cabinet ministers in 4 different departments. She also resides in the Kitchener-Waterloo area, knows the tech sector incredibly well, and has lots of campaign experience in that neck of the woods. Chris Ball is a former executive with both CBC and Vice Canada, Vice Media, also a senior advisor to Jack Layton when he was the federal leader, and Ontario NDP leader Andrea Horwath. Last but not least, Olivia Dixon, who worked previously for the government of British Columbia in the Vancouver Cabinet Office under Premier Horwath and Horgan, and was also co-chair of the BC chapter of Equal Voice. Those of you who have joined before know also we set the conversation up with some public opinion research. And towards that end, we're also joined by Doug Anderson, who works out of our Ottawa office and heads up our public opinion research practice. He's been both aggregating all the publicly available polls that are out there and looking for trend lines, as well as every week doing some custom work that provides insight into both how we analyze what's going on in the campaign and informs the kind of strategies we advise to the people we work with. So, Doug, what have you got for us this week?
All right. Well, let me get to the deck that I've got to share. And turn it into the right mode. All right, is that showing just the slide? Great. Well, we do our own weekly tracking, and as Alan said, we also take a look at all the public polls, the polls that have been published, and do our own sort of aggregation of those as well. So we're going to go over those and give you some context for today's conversation. All of this stuff is available on our website, and you can feel free to check into the methodology as we go. It's an online survey that we've been doing. First of all, the 30,000-foot view of national tracking. This is all the publicly available polls released since April of this year. As you can see, the concentration of dots gets pretty intense in these last few weeks since basically the campaign started. And the story is obvious that where there was a Liberal lead for throughout this year, as soon as we got into campaign mode, things started to shift, and perhaps the most dramatic is the lead tightening and then flipping, with Conservatives taking the lead, and even in the last few days, last week or so, the numbers are suggesting that that's tightened back up again, with the Liberals and Conservatives in a pretty close battle at the top. It's been a long, slow, steady climb, I would argue, for the NDP. Down at the bottom of this chart, one of the trends that's been sort of most striking, certainly capturing our attention, has been the upswing in the purple dots. And the PPC is now in a lot of polls turning out to be the party with the 4th most support nationally. But nationally, in Canada, when you're below 40%, it really is all about the regional battles. So we tend to want to focus on those. There, the picture's dramatically different depending on the region you're looking at. In the prairies and Alberta, you've got a large conservative lead. Maybe it's not as large as it was. Well, it isn't as large as it was last election. The dots on the left-hand side of these axes are all showing what each party was at during the election. But they still have a large lead in those areas. In Atlantic Canada's maybe a Liberal lead, but as you can see, the dots start to get really messy towards the end. Not as messy as BC. BC is, it's almost chaotic. The polls that come out are constantly showing flux and change in leadership, but maybe more high CPC standings than the others, but really very tight battle for the NDP, the CPC and LBC in BC. Quebec and Ontario, largest provinces, obviously most seats at play, are showing a change that is also important to keep monitoring. Looks like recently the Bloc Québécois has dropped off a little bit, and Liberals as well, perhaps, to the benefit of both the CPC and NDP, which you'll recall we were talking in the past about our second choice. And BQ voters, for example, were not indicating any second choice preference for the Liberal Party. And we're kind of torn between CPC and NDP. And it looks like there's been some shift and it's benefited those parties, as our numbers would have suggested. Ontario, very tight battle now on the top line for the Liberals and Conservatives. With the NDP, holding steady. Some polls have them up higher than they were. They're all basically doing. All the polls say the NDP is basically doing better in Ontario than last election, but some of them have them doing significantly better. There's a lot of wobble, I would say, in that. But the PPC has also seen a lot of polls show high numbers in Ontario recently. Just like we say, the national hides regional battles that matter. Places like Ontario and BC are particularly where it holds true again. There are regional battles in there that we don't have data for that are really the things that are going to decide how a lot of seats get distributed in those two areas. In our own vote intention tracking, we've been doing this for 4 weeks now, so we're showing you just our own snapshots for the past month. And what it shows is echoing the aggregate that we've seen. But we have a dead tie for the Liberals and Conservatives on a national level. NDP, maybe a slight fluctuation there, but basically holding steady around the 20% mark. And as you can see, also the PPC moved past the Green Party in our polling. This is our regional snapshot right now. Shows large Liberal lead in Atlantic Canada.
But this was in the field on Thursday to Sunday of last week. Is that correct?
That's right, September 3rd to 5th. And a Liberal lead, but not quite as large in Quebec. Basically a tie between Liberals and Conservatives in Ontario, as we said, that echoes the aggregate. But the NDP at 23% is a really sizable chunk. Looking at BC, we had statistically absolute tie between Liberals, NDP, and Conservatives.
Doug, I've got to tell you, that looks almost exactly like the 2019 results by region, almost identical.
Yeah, actually, one of the things that is different, and I think it's reflecting in the tie on a national level, is the prairies aren't quite as dominant CPC. These numbers, are pretty high, but if you dominate even more, if you get to like 65% and get some higher numbers in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, that's what pushes the Conservatives to a point where they get the lead on the popular vote, but it doesn't translate into more seats because they're already getting all the seats they can in those areas. So that's one of the things that I think is affecting the fact that we see a dead tie, where that doesn't mean any less performance in seats for the Conservatives than last time. There's 3 slides we want to show on some demographic differences that we think matter. First is the gender. That for the last couple of weeks, we were seeing among women, for example, CPC and Liberal vote basically tied, which was unusual for what we've seen in the last several elections by gender. And NDP had been steadily gaining among women, but in the last week alone, there have been some changes there, and the Liberals have opened up the more traditional lead over the Conservatives that we're used to seeing. And there's been a similar change among men. There was the moment 2 weeks ago where there was a tie between Liberals and Conservatives. The Liberals had actually had a lead among men, and that's gone. That's what we're showing. And these are more, as I say, traditional results. Age, this has been fascinating. Each of these three cohorts tend to have different levels of voter turnout, which really matters, and it makes telling the story by age a little bit difficult sometimes. But would draw your attention to the 18 to 34 cohort, because that's been the most sort of bumpy in the last 2 weeks. There was a huge increase in NDP support among that cohort, and then that basically totally went back to where we were 2 weeks ago, to the benefit of the Liberals to some degree. But look at that purple line. The PPC support suddenly shot up in our polling among 18 to 34 in the last week. And that struck us as a little counterintuitive. It's important to bear in mind who it is that's supporting the PPC now and why, because it might not fit all of your assumptions all the time. 35 to 54 basically echoes the national battle. And the 55 plus, Conservatives have a lead, which is more traditional, but perhaps not as significant a lead as we might have seen in past elections. And finally, one break that we've been talking a lot about in these webinars has been the suburban vote. And while the Liberals enjoy a very slight advantage in urban ridings, each of the three major parties are getting a fair share of support among urban ridings. In the suburban ridings, however, what started off as a very large Liberal lead has turned into a knock 'em down, drag 'em out fight between the Liberals and Conservatives, and the NDP, of course, trying to build on the momentum that they had early. But it seems in the last week, our numbers saw them dip in the suburbs a little bit. Rural, maybe a little bit of an anomalous result last week, but basically still showing a significant Conservative advantage in rural ridings. Last part I want to share is we tested 8 issues, and there's a sort of a pollster traditional way of asking about issues, which is, which party do you think is best on? And that helps us understand a little bit about whether there's an issue that is a strategic lever that a party can pull in order to try to gain support. The more that an issue that they are relatively strong at becomes important to people, the more they talk about it with people, the more they try to get them to make it a priority issue and as a factor influencing the vote, the more chance that they might have to secure that vote. And Canadians have an ability to see one party as being particularly good at something, even if it might not be the party they support. So here, what we're seeing is the Conservative Party has a pretty significant advantage on managing government finances, about the same advantage on managing the economy. Liberals enjoy quite an advantage on managing the COVID-19 pandemic. For the NDP, improving the lives of Indigenous people in healthcare, more Canadians, more voters are likely to say that they're the best party on that. But on housing, they have a bit more of an advantage compared to the other parties. But we thought that forcing people to choose a single best party on an issue sometimes hides the potential. So we also asked it in this way, which is, well, are these parties good enough for you on each of these issue areas? And what that tends to do is increases the total proportion who are willing to say that party, okay, maybe I didn't say they were the best, but they're good enough for me, which gives you an indication of whether, again, it can be a lever or maybe even a weakness where people can say, yeah, I did say you're the best on it, but this other party is good enough for me, so that's no longer an advantage for you, and might indicate some vulnerability. And I think the best way to examine this is to look at the results by partisanship. So among Conservative Party voters right now, the people who are decided and leaning conservative in our survey, there's actually little tendency, the least tendency of the three parties we're going to look at, to say that any other party is good enough on any issue. And if it's about the economy or managing finances, conservative voters right now, they are really unlikely in single digits to say any other party is good enough on those. So if those things are what are being talked about among conservative circles, they're not going to be shaken off. It gets maybe a little bit more like there are some conservatives who can be moved if the issues are housing or pandemic or childcare, climate change, or improving the lives of Indigenous peoples. But those are, as you'll see in the next two slides, relatively small proportions compared to what's at risk, let's say, for the other parties. On this slide, I look at this though, and I say that NDP strategists might be looking at housing as one where the more that we can talk to conservative voters about housing be important, the more we might have a unique advantage in having them consider voting for our party. And likewise for the Liberals, the unique advantage, if there is one, is on managing the pandemic. Among NDP, the numbers of people willing to say another party has good enough policies, a little higher, but it does dominate among its own decided and leaning voters on a number of policy areas. But as you can see, on something like managing the pandemic, 32% of those who are voting NDP right now are saying, well, the Liberals are good enough for me on that, even though there's a Homer effect, let's say, of picking the party that you prefer on that. And childcare, it's still a large gap, but 27% think the Liberals might be good enough on that. Managing government finances, if it comes down to it, that's the one where the Conservatives might be able to get some NDP movement if it's an issue that they're going to be talking about. Finally, among Liberal voters, we've got the highest number of people willing to name some other party as being good enough for them on just about anything. And basically 25 to 30% of Liberal voters right now are saying another party is good enough. And it tends to be the NDP that they're saying about just about any policy. And you can see here on this slide, the contrast between the orange bar and the blue bar is what tells you about a unique advantage. So the more that NDP can get the conversation to be about housing, for example, you see that at 47%, it's the lowest proportion of Liberals who are saying that that party has good enough policies for them. And it's pretty similar number who are saying that of the NDP. So making housing be a topic of more salience is a strategy for getting some Liberal voters to possibly shift to the NDP. Conservatives don't enjoy any unique advantage among the 8 issues that we tested, but obviously managing the finances and the economy being their strong suits anyway, tend to be the ones that have the most promise.
I mean, the importance of these data go to the old campaign maxim of find an issue and make it your issue, either by that becoming the focus of your attention in your advertising, and or an external event that drives up the salience of the issue. So that's very insightful, Doug. I want to thank you very much. Really appreciate you joining us, and we'll see a member of the team, if not you, back next week. Sorry, Julie.
Just one quick question from Doug from one of our viewers around voter turnout. Doug, wondering if you can speak to how you see voter turnout playing out. Will it exceed 2019, or will we see regional differences based on some of the numbers you're seeing coming out of the field?
Okay, it's an interesting question, and it's one that we've been talking about internally. The last couple elections have been relatively high turnout compared to what the previous 3 or 4 had been. So the trend had looked like it shot up. 2015 was a really big turnout. 2019 was lower, but not. It was still higher than what we'd seen historically. We don't have any numbers ourselves that are going to say, this is the proportion saying they're likely to vote. I would say Alan's got as good an answer for you as I do on this, but if you want my gut, it's that the issues where people are more emotionally attached, the campaigns where people are more emotionally attached or feel something is really at stake, tend to be the ones that have the highest turnout. And I'm not sure, the feeling I'm getting about this election suggests to me that it won't be as high as last time. And it's only a gut feeling. And I would say, Alan, would you have?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that we actually cannot do. I mean, there's a pollster's maxim is that you cannot predict behavior in the absence of events that would engender behavior. And so if you ask a straightforward question, how likely is it you're going to vote? 80% will say I'm very likely. So it's an over-reporting of behavior. We know that's not the case. What we can do is that we can identify the 60% of the electorate that is most likely to vote, or the 50% of the electorate that's most likely to vote, or the 70% of the electorate that is most likely to vote, and be able to say that if the turnout level is this is what the result will be. And if the turnout level is this, that it'll be this. But we cannot predict the turnout. Turnout will be different if it rains or if it doesn't rain. And it's just one of the limits of the discipline that we work around. But anyway, again, Doug, thank you very much. I mean, it gives us a unique perspective on everything we do, and we couldn't do the work that we do without it. So much appreciated. We're in week 4, 9 days left. All of us have been there before. We all know that if there is a single event in a campaign that can actually make a difference, it's debates. We pushed our webinar back 2 days in order to be able to talk about what transpired in the French language debate on Wednesday night and the English language debate last night. I want to go around the horn, starting with you, Chris, and say, what was your main takeaway? What was the highlight of this debate for you? And was there anything in there that was sufficiently significant to change the outcome of this election?
So I think I see this in 2 different ways. One from the NDP seat, in the fact that I think Jagmeet had a very strong performance. For a lot of people, this may have been maybe the first time seeing him, and you got to once again see authentic Jagmeet. You got to see actually a little bit more of a fighter out of Jagmeet than we've seen over the last little while in the campaign, and really dialing up that prosecution of the Liberal record, but also pointing across to Mr. O'Toole and saying, listen, you can pick blue door or red door, you're going to get the same outcome. So laying a bit of the track when it comes to his, maybe what part of his end game message will be. If I'm the Prime Minister's team and Team Trudeau, I'm not particularly that happy, I don't think, about the outcome yesterday. I think the PM or the Liberal leader who had to show up yesterday to give people that reason to come back home to Liberals. So a bit more chastened Justin Trudeau, a little less arrogant, possibly Justin Trudeau, didn't necessarily show up last night. He was a bit chippy and a bit defensive, and that was, I think, maybe to the Liberal team's deficit or detriment.
Olivia, what stood out for you?
I agree with Chris. The leader of the Liberal Party did not come across as a very likable person, in my opinion, on the last debate. Very defensive. I felt like he was kind of taking shots that were low bars, especially at Anna May Paul. I thought O'Toole did pretty okay. He didn't have any standout moments, but he didn't do anything that would make the voters less likely to like him. You could tell during this entire debate that everybody was just trying to get their one-liners, their clips in. And I think Jagmeet did the best at sticking to his point, not coming across as angry or defensive, just coming across as a likable person that voters would want to be in charge. And I really enjoyed his ability to contrast on one hand, you have a party that says they're going to do something but hasn't done it yet. And on the other hand, you have a party that also says they're going to do something but hasn't done it before. You don't have only 2 options.
Dan, what were you thinking?
Through the 3 debates, in the first 2 French and the English one last night, I think there was one real common theme that's not even a policy or an issue. It was like, why are we in an election at this time, 18 months before or after the last election? So I think that that team, that question over and over and over from all parties to the Prime Minister is a tough one that is weighing in, quite a bit into this election.
So you were surprised that that issue continues to dog the Liberals, because normally
every
it goes away.
time, every debate, it came back. So I was quite surprised that it sticks and sticks and sticks. And even the animators, even the journalists, were asking that question over and over. So, besides that, to go back to the poll and number of people, because I found that question quite interesting. If people would go out, I think that the mail-in ballot, will be another interesting twist in this election that we never seen before. So that was just another angle of that one.
One of the things we're going to ask, just for our viewers and our panelists, is if what that in the next poll that we do is whether people have voted already in mail ballot, and look at the difference between those who have voted already via mail versus those who haven't and intend to go to the ballot box. Julie, what's your overall view of what transpired the last couple of nights?
Yeah, thanks very much, Alan. Well, I do appreciate the comments from my colleagues. I do have to disagree. I think in terms of Trudeau, he came and yes, he was chippier and probably a little bit angrier than I would have liked him to be. But I think as a Liberal voter, and many Liberals, they wanted to see that their leader was still passionate, still inspired, still wanted to fight for them and fight for the country. And as we saw in Doug's research and the research that just came out of the field, fighting on behalf of COVID-19 is certainly a #1 issue amongst Liberal voters. And I think that Trudeau, through his performance, showed that he wanted to stand up and keep fighting for Canadians. So I think that was an important message to get across. Yes, there were moments of weakness and certainly some comments that I'm sure they would like to take back. But at the same time, I think there were a couple missions that he wanted to accomplish. And one was to show that maybe Jagmeet's not ready. And I don't know that the NDP leader necessarily came out and showed the confidence that I think voters would need to shift their votes from the Liberal Party to the NDP, even though the research is saying that the policy is good enough. I think there was a higher level of expectation this time for Mr. Singh, and not sure he met it on all the bars. And there were certainly some interesting exchanges where he got held to task. As far as Mr. O'Toole goes, I think he came out, showed that he was steady, but certainly there were some issues there in terms of his caucus that I think will have those thinking about potentially shifting their vote, questioning that decision. So I think it was an interesting debate. Obviously, a huge disservice to democracy in the format and with no opening and closing statements. So highly disappointed in that. I don't think there were really it was any clear winner in that debate last night. I think folks came out and did what they have to do. I do have to say that Anna May Paul certainly was definitely the best at getting her points across for the audience. I wish she would have had some more energy in her remarks yesterday, but I did think that was a solid performance on her behalf.
So no knockout punch.
I don't really think there was any kind of knockout, no major moment that's going to create a wave, in my opinion.
On that one, Alan.
Sure, Dan, go ahead.
On knockout, I totally agree. And all through the three debates, there wasn't any knockout that we've seen in the past, by example, in some of those debates. But I have to say, I was quite impressed with both Jagmeet and O'Toole's French, on both French debates. Of course, it's a major advantage for debaters that are used to the French format and used in French and all that, like Prime Minister Trudeau and Blanchette, of course, the leader of the Bloc Québécois. But it didn't come across like as strongly because they knew, Jagmeet and also O'Toole knew their messages very well, and they stick to them, and I think that they came across quite nicely.
I want to bring Olivia in here because Julie touched on this, but regardless of who kind of did best, did middling, did worse, I'm interested in your view on whether these debates provide the kind of platform they're supposed to provide, which is to give the electorate an opportunity to understand the differences in the options before them. What did you think of the format of the debates, which has been much criticized by both political pundits and also television reviewers?
I think it depends on what you want from a debate. I know as political junkies, we're looking for more platform points to gain more information. One would hope that's also what the average Canadian is watching a debate for. But in my experience, most average Canadians don't watch the debates. And if they do, it's for entertainment. And you have to admit, yesterday's debate was entertaining. I didn't get to hear a lot of extra details than I did during the campaign and when they do their press releases, but it was definitely, for me at least, fun to watch. Talking, in my experience of debates, people talking over each other is just common. Honestly, if you're going to this debate to try and hear something like new, I don't think that was what you're going to get here. If you wanted to go see a good show, yeah, like Rosemary Barton holding everybody to account. I was yelling at my TV, I was clapping. It was kind of like watching football games. I assume this is how people who watch sports feel.
There you go. Chris, I mean, I know you think that that Jagmeet did well, but I mean, both in 2015 and 2019, the NDP has got squeezed in a binary choice by saying this is either going to be a Liberal government or a Conservative government. Did he do enough to distance himself from the Liberals? And what does he have to do in the balance of the week to actually start attracting some Liberal voters? What does he have to do to close the deal?
So I think the campaigns have been incredibly disciplined this time around about sharpening that prosecution, about what you've been promised and what you've actually not been delivered over the last 6 years, right? And so for the first time in, I think, a couple of campaigns, we've actually had quite a sharp, pointed message about we're not the Liberals. You can't trust the Liberals when it comes to delivering X, Y, and Z thing. And I think that's partially why you're seeing our number stay where it is, in the fact that we're holding a lot of those Liberal NDP switchers, because there is a bit of unrest around the poor follow through from this government is perceived by a lot of folks. But as you note, there's still more to do. So this is a campaign for us, I think, in two acts. Obviously, one is let's make sure that we're prosecuting the person who is responsible for the ills that he now says are plaguing this country. And that's why apparently we have this election. And now it's about closing the deal. And what I mean by closing the deal is you need to up the urgency and the salience of what the ballot box question is from our view. And usually the ballot box question is one of three modes: more of the same, change, or send them a message. And I think you'll probably see us starting to sharpen the knife a little bit more on the send them a message piece. You noted in the polls around where the biggest gaps are, where people see us as the most credible second option. You saw a lot of debate yesterday around Indigenous issues, specifically the lack of movement on the boil water advisories, and as well when it comes to the lack of real movement on reconciliation, and as well as affordable housing. Those are three issues that are really strong for us, and specifically with that cohort of those last three. So it's about driving the salience and the urgency of those issues, but it's talking specifically about how this last 6 years have cost you in those areas, and cost you and your family either time in getting these things fixed or money in not being able to afford a house. And really, really driving that us versus them. We're the ones who can get this done, they won't.
What about pharmacare? I mean, it's probably the single biggest difference between the platform of the Liberals and the NDP. Going to put that in the window?
Well,
yeah, I think
yeah,
go ahead, Olivia.
Let Chris finish, then I'll go right to you.
No, I'm going to pass it to Olivia.
My favorite part about the pharmacare promise from the Liberals is I believe the first time they said it was in 1997. So I was still in preschool then, and I'm still waiting for pharmacare.
Chris, you want to just add to that at all?
Yeah, I mean, like, I think this has been a bit of an interesting logical leap for me to get my head around, about how we have a government who has said, who at one point said, pharmacare, really important issue, but then voted against it when it comes to the opportunity to do so when it was brought forward in the House, and then keeps banging on about how it's important, but it's actually not in the platform. So I think there is a strong contrast there around pharmacare for sure, because it is a very specific example of where those NDP Liberal switcher heads are at around, you keep telling me you're going to give me this good stuff, and you don't really give me the good stuff. Like, what's going on, right? So I think that can help drive
the all talk, no action kind of line that the NDP is moving. Julie, I mean, when you're an incumbent, and you've run campaigns for incumbent, I mean, you're forced to defend your record, and that often means you're forced to defend the status quo, which when everyone's happy is fine, but when they're not really happy, it's a very uncomfortable position to be in. And we saw all the other leaders go after Justin Trudeau last night. Did his performance demonstrate that he's got enough gas in the tank to continue on and to be the natural governing party and the most obvious prime minister of Canada?
Yeah, it's always a tough spot. And you saw Justin Trudeau speaking very quickly in his responses, trying to get as many bullets out as possible in terms of what they've done for their record. I think the Boil Water Advisory Exchange was one of the ones where I think he demonstrated that there's been progress. There had been kind of a black and white viewpoint of you've done nothing. And what I think Justin Trudeau was trying to get out through that exchange is that they may have not have made the progress that they wanted to make, but they are making progress. And I think that was good. I don't necessarily, I mean, just because of the format and how quickly the points were coming across, I don't know that it necessarily will resonate to switch people's votes. But I think that they did enough to shore up seeds of doubt that were forming in people's minds. As Chris said, as the knife sharpens this week, there could be kind of fresh wounds dug, but I think that he did enough last night to assure people that he has made progress in some key areas. And that more is coming, and to restore a little bit of that trust. But this week will be telling on that front.
We saw his pre-election lead, and we also saw in our own polls, he gets tremendous grades for managing the pandemic. And, probably also, we didn't include it, but for the wage support systems that he put in during the pandemic. I mean, if he has to defend his record anyway, why hasn't he done more to put those things in the window, do you think?
I mean, this has been unprecedented times, truly, and that we've been speaking about the pandemic now for the last 18 months, almost incessantly. There has been times in our daily work where we have not been able to talk about other issues because it's not to do with the most important and pressing issue facing Canadians. So I think that's been a challenge for the Trudeau government as they've led into this election, is that really they haven't been able to go and trumpet all the things that they have been doing on other files to the same extent as you would in a non-pandemic time. So I think that has been a bit of a weakness and a bit of a challenging point. And now we get into this election where there's a lot of question on why are we even having this election? And they're trying to put their record in the window that hasn't really been socialized by the media or with Canadians for the last kind of 18 months to 2 years.
Dan, I mean, the Liberals have been trying to find a wedge issue where they can get Erin O'Toole and the Conservatives on the wrong side of public opinion. I mean, they haven't seemed to be able to do it. But as I say, they've definitely tried, whether it's on vaccines or assault weapons or on childcare. And now they're also trying to tie O'Toole to some positions that the rank and file of the party has adopted, particularly on climate change. What's going to be his biggest challenge in this last week?
Mm-hmm. Any of those issues have you mentioned, like they haven't stick yet, and most of them did not even come back, to the next debate after that. They talk about it once and then the next debate it wasn't there. I think that what Erin O'Toole has succeeded to do in a very short time since the leadership, which happened only last year, he succeeded to turn around and refocus on some of those social issues that were dragging the party down. Basically, this is why the Conservative don't have some 70 or 60% of the votes in the prairies, but now they're down around the 55, something like that. That means that you give way to evacuate some issues that you cannot even talk about in Ontario, in Quebec, or Atlantic Canada, So I think that he's been very smart to turning that ship quickly. And I think that if you go from 60% vote to 55 or 50%, even in the prairies, you still have a large majority there, So, but then how can you capture the attention of Quebecers, of Ontarians, and also keeping people in British Columbia, at bay, also in the sense that they are interested in the Conservative Party because they have the majority of seats in British Columbia as we speak. So I think it was a smart strategy, to be totally frank, to turn this boat.
Well, I want to ask each of you fairly quickly on that exactly, because there was one leader who wasn't on that debate stage the last two nights, and that is Maxime Bernier in the People's Party. We saw what Doug showed, and that some of the pollsters have got them up as high as 10% of the popular vote. Erin O'Toole and the Conservatives early on made a huge strategic bet, and they said we have to expand our base of support, even if it means we ignore our flank and don't focus on motivating our base, with what everyone acknowledges is a very centrist, if not actually a progressive kind of platform. If the People's Party keeps on coming up, could this be the single biggest strategic mistake of the campaign, Chris?
I think one of the interesting things is the PPC isn't necessarily a professional political party at this point, right? They don't have the sort of get out the vote infrastructure that other parties do. They're kind of this, assemblage of, the folks who were frustrated throughout COVID on the vaccination question and lockdowns. And it's sort of that, the freedom, big freedom folks. You've got a bit of that libertarian streak. You've got some, overall protest vote and disaffected voters. And you also have a tranche there that, let's be honest, has been around for quite a while. And that's some of the white supremacist vote that has kind of been inching up over the last 3-4 years here in the country. So is it a strategic mistake for Erin O'Toole? I don't think we know the answer to that yet, because we don't know whether or not PPCs can actually get their vote out. There's a possibility of some...
everyone I think they had 1.6% of the popular vote last time.
Right. And so is this just a parked vote?
As I say, it's hard to tell.
No.
Do you have any view on this at all?
Yeah, and certainly have a question from one of our viewers around kind of, is the surge real? And I can't speak definitively. We really won't know until election day how real that is and how represented the PPC vote is in the polling that has been taking, especially with so much online polling going on. And certainly we've had lots of online internal discussions on that particular fact. I can say that we're seeing, more and more, at least here in Ontario and Southwestern Ontario, more and more PPC signs being proudly displayed on lawns. I am hearing kind of from folks in the field just as early as this morning that there seems to be a growing nervousness around the growing support for the PPC, especially, as Alan said, amongst those that have been protesting how the pandemic has been handled.
Olivia, want to offer a view?
I'm concerned. I'm not surprised or shocked by this based on the way the world has worked. But as a person of color, I am concerned. I am white supremacist, the whole thing. The fact that the party even exists because of the far right leaning ideas that Maxine had is concerning. And honestly, it may cost O'Toole the election, but I think he made the right choice. I wouldn't want those kind of beliefs in my party if you really are trying to be a more progressive version of Conservatives. If you are really trying to represent all of Canada, you can't be so closed-minded.
Dan, I want to shift the focus a little bit to Quebec, because we all know what happens in Quebec has a major impact on what happens in the nation in the final election outcome. This week we saw Premier Legault once again, for the second time, wade in to the federal campaign, and that he quite purposely excluded Erin O'Toole and the Conservatives when he named the other three parties as dangerous to the interests of Quebec. But he didn't let them completely off the hook, because he says you've got to come clean on what's going to happen to that $6 billion in childcare transfer that I'm going to get from the federal government. And people who follow Quebec politics say this is a big deal in the province. What's your take on balance? Does Legault's intervention help O'Toole more than hurt him, or does it hurt O'Toole more than help him?
In Quebec, the vote to have Legault, that has a very high level of support in Quebec and is in his role in the pandemic and all that, he has a very strong base of supporters. And I think to transfer some of that to O'Toole, I think it should help O'Toole. But also we know that is very close, or there's alignment with the Bloc Québécois also, so there's no doubt there. So it's I think securing that vote on both sides there. It's basically edging your bet to a certain point. But it's funny that we never have those discussions when at the time, last elections and all that. Kathleen Wynne, by example, or premiers in other provinces support the Liberal at the federal level. But now in Quebec, it has a big difference when something happened like that. I always find that interesting. And also, don't forget that Maxime also, Bernier, is coming from Quebec. So in that sense, I don't believe that if people really up to 10% consider to vote for a party that wasn't even invited at the debate this time, I think there's an underlying undertow, undercurrent that is stronger than we see on the surface. And it's not white supremacists. People are not, they don't see themselves represented at the federal level, at the political level. And I think it's an undercurrent that we should not underestimate. We've seen that in UK and many other countries, and it's not just very fringe people that are trying to steer the pot, I think that we need to take a serious look at those numbers and consideration. And Annamie Paul, I have to say that it was great that she could bring her message at the national level for the first time like she did, This time, I think there might be some kind of sympathy that Maxime could not even bring his message at the federal level or at the debate.
Well, I think one of the reasons that we focus so much on Quebec is because, history has shown us that this is a province that could move en masse one way or another. And because they do represent 25% of the total population, you get a 10-point swing in the province of Quebec, your national numbers are going to move 2.5 points. And that Ontario, it seems, for whatever reason, Julie, seems to be particularly susceptible to these kind of changes, the change perceptions of momentum. Do you think that's the case this time, if that kind of movement started to happen, or is there a different dynamic today than in the past?
Yeah, so a couple of points here. So I think that I think there has been a historic kind of alliance between Ontario and Quebec that we stand together, that maybe doesn't exist today. But where I do think it's very important is if the Quebec numbers start to shift, it really can potentially change the mix of who could potentially fill the seat of Prime Minister in Canada. And I think Ontario voters and kind of those that are kind of undecided or considering other parties that might be good enough do really look heavily at kind of who is the likely winner of this election and who can be a real contender as they vote potentially strategically. And so I don't think we've seen any kind of mass movement in Quebec. I wondered whether or not with Legault's endorsement yesterday and then the debate last night, whether or not we would see O'Toole start a bit of a wave in Quebec and that could potentially have an influence in Ontario. I don't think we saw that yesterday. And I think with Blanchette's performance, there was certainly a Quebec versus rest of Canada kind of theme on that could have actually turned people off of kind of supporting those parties that may be politically desirable in Quebec.
Chris, Julie just said the word wave, and I know you thought Orange Wave, 2011, over 100 seats. We all recall that started with a massive shift towards the NDP in the province of Quebec. Party's now down to 1 seat. What kind of priority does it place on the province right now? I mean, is it more or less exclusively focused on BC and Ontario, or do they still believe that they can pick up seats in the province?
So the Orange Wave was a massive shift in one election that was 10 years in the making, right? And so that was, Jack and staffers going, doing the rubber chicken circuit in the eastern townships and meeting everybody that they possibly could to sort of introduce himself. And it was Jack working hard on his trying to have a bit more of working class Quebecois French versus the sort of mutated Ontario Parisian French that a lot of our leaders try to spew out in French debates. So my point being that, so the wave that happened didn't just happen, it happened because of hard work. That hard work is still continuing in the province for us, but I do take your point. I think we need to work a heck of a lot harder. This campaign, though, we have seen a dedicated Quebec campaign, which is something we didn't have in 2019. We've had a dedicated series of Quebec ads, which I'm sure you're going to see the frequency get a lot hotter over the next couple of days, next 10 days, with specific creative that looks nothing like the creative that's in the rest of Canada, right? So it is something that we are definitely interested in, and that it is something that we haven't given up on Quebec, but it takes time, right? This is Jagmeet's second election. This is his second French debate, and probably the first time that we've had a really more muscular Quebec campaign than we have in the past.
we are running out of time, and I do want to get to the advertising, but first, Olivia, I mean, one of the most intense clashes we saw last night was not between the contenders, but between the moderator and BQ leader Yves-Francois Blanchet, who took great exception to the notion that Bill C-21 was discriminatory. In fact, in his presser, after the debate, he went on a real rant in French that this entire debate was about English Canada accusing Quebecers of being racist. Now, we know that young people, Black people, Indigenous, people of color, are far more active and engaged in this campaign than they have before. What's your take on that kind of controversy?
I was mad. I'm not gonna lie. I was very upset when he said that. It is not racist to question policies that affect people of color. The fact that he keeps flipping it to when we have a genuine question about the legitimacy of a policy that drastically affects people of color. I know the understanding is that it's because of religious reasons, but it's not just because of religious reasons. It's targeting groups of ethnicities. And you can't, every time you're upset about being questioned on something that you support, go, well, you just call us all racist. That is dangerous. That is how the United States got to where it is today. I do not condone it. I feel like if you're going to actually argue that your policy is good, then you should argue that your policy is good, not just go, the people of color who are accusing me, who are questioning this policy, are accusing all of Quebec to be racist. That's dangerous. That leads to more PPC votes. Actually, not even more PPC votes. That leads to more hate and spreading hate and division. And I know we do a lot of division in politics, but it shouldn't be this kind of division. Like, we're all partisan. We all take our stances. But the moment you start bringing race into it that way, it's not okay, especially when Anna Marie Paul did what all of us people of color have been doing for the last 2 years. When questioned on something that had to do with them, they looked at the person who's never lived the experience and said, please go educate yourself, because it's not our job to educate you.
Alan, there's a question from a viewer here around the PPC support being a reflection of COVID fatigue, or is this kind of the Trump right-wing surge, even the right-wing surge that we saw come to be in Europe a number of years ago? So I don't know who would like to handle that question, but I think it fits well here.
We've done a little bit of research on it. I mean, the thing that Doug pointed out is interesting and surprising for many is that they are not all old, white, rural people. That there's a sharp spike of young people. This is the Jordan Peterson crowd who believe that they are being wrongly put upon in the context of debates around Black Lives Matter, among these kind of issues. We also know that they're way more likely than average to believe that this whole COVID business has been overblown. We haven't analyzed it in any depth because it's just starting. So, but I think this will be something that we'll focus on next week. As I said, we are running out of time here, and I do want to talk about the advertising that Chris brought up, and to start with Chris, because in the last election, 2019, the NDP's total budget for everything they did, for the leaders tour, for headquarters staff and everything, was $10.5 million. This year, they're spending $10.5 million just on paid advertising. What difference does this have the potential to make in the last week of the campaign?
I mean, it's a good example of the NDP doing well with managing the finances, I would say. So in all seriousness, though, NDP campaigns have traditionally been very front-loaded, right? And so what we end up doing is putting high attention to the tour and the early set of ads to just kind of prove that, hey, we're here, we're in the game, and then we kind of then flatline from there, and then we hope we have money towards the end, and then sometimes we have it and sometimes we don't. having a $10.5 million budget now allows us to be a lot more strategic and a lot more tactical about where and when we place our ad buy to help forestall some of what you were talking about, we were talking about earlier around that, like, we know what's going to happen. Liberals are going to come to us and say, don't vote for those guys, because that means you're going to get conservatives. It gives us a little bit more ammo to be able to push back harder on some of that strategic voting message. But it also gives us a way better opportunity for us to put our best asset, Jagmeet, in the window over the last 10 days when people are trying to make that decision about, am I really that frustrated about what's happening in the country with Justin Trudeau and his lack of ability to deliver, which has been our message. And, oh, now I'm seeing this guy who's coming to me with a hopeful uniter message, and also talking about the priorities that matter to me at a really urgent level. Being able to send those messages in the last 10 days are going to be also incredibly important, because we can't afford to be silent in the last 10 days in the advertising war, because it's going to get really hot. So we better be playing that game, otherwise we're out of the game.
Well, Dan, by the same token, I mean, we didn't see much of conservative advertising before Labor Day. So it looks like they're back end loading their campaign as well. What is going to be their main message through their advertising in the last week?
It has been very targeted so far, you know, like very like targets the groups like the older people, single mom, you know, that then, or and in Quebec, by example, they use individuals to talk about their businesses, their small and medium-sized businesses, how, you know, a new fiscal approach, you know, better restriction on financial expenses and all that would work better for them. So the next wave, I would say that they would target on a broader audience, like they will go for the broader audience, like they've done the specific targeted one now. So now they will try to position him possibly as prime ministerial and
But
go
was
into that.
Was the focus on the leader and leadership on O'Toole, do you think?
I think the leader would be totally at the center of it, because his performance at the debate were good. And now I think that we may need to explain more the plan that he talked so much about during the debate.
Julie, I mean, there's no question that the Liberal campaign thus far has been focused on the leader, and in the early stage, very positive, very upbeat kind of messages, a little sharper edge right now. With 1 week to go, what's the likelihood that we could see the Liberal advertising turn very negative?
I think there's a strong likelihood that there'll definitely be negative undertones, the backwards, especially going after Mr. O'Toole in those advertisements and really trying to contrast the plans as being drastically different. So you'll see focus on those key issues like fighting COVID-19, like housing, like the daycare plan, where there are stark differences between Mr. O'Toole and Mr. Trudeau. And so you will see those trying to basically try and shore up the Liberal vote against the NDP as well as against the Conservatives in this next week. So we will see definitely more negativity.
Now, the tyranny of time is upon us, but I'm going to end with Olivia. I mean, for us old farts, social media has changed everything in terms of, I'm not including you, Chris, I've said, speaking for my generation. So social media has changed everything about campaigning, including how you, not just how you target your messages, but what actual messages you make. You follow social media very closely, and especially TikTok. Show us what Jagmeet Singh is doing right now and tell us why he's doing it.
1 second. I'm ready for this. Can you all see it?
Yep.
Perfect.
Friends, how you doing? I gotta say a huge thank you for everyone texting. I love the messages. The vibes are amazing. And I got a request for you. I need music recommendations. I love music. I got my Bluetooth speaker with me, jamming out, having great energy on the bus, but your recommendations would help. So send them along, text me up at 613-801-8210. Let me know what you listen to. Let me know what you're vibing with. Let me know what I should be bumping on the bus. Thanks.
Now, I've got to tell you, as someone who's crafted hundreds and hundreds of campaign messages, that would have never dawned on me to be the focus of my outward talk. What is he trying to do here?
He's being a genius, frankly. my favorite thing to mention is like no one thought Facebook was going to be useful for campaigning. No one thought Twitter was going to be useful for campaigning. And look where we're at now. So being the first on a bandwagon, especially where not just youth are on TikTok, we were all stuck inside for a good like 2 years now. If you think that only youth are on TikTok or using, for example, what was the game? Animal Crossing?
Animal Crossing.
Yep. You're a little bit naive right now, especially seeing how TikTok targets to people. So like if something comes across your feed, it's because of the algorithm, it relates to you. And this is genius because we all know how much information is important. But he's asking people, just send me a text message. I tried it out because I had never seen it before. And I sent him a text message with one of my favorite songs, and I got a reply being like, "I'm making a playlist, and we're going to send it out to you when we get it all done and we get all your suggestions." And to me, I actually feel like I'm participating with him. It feels not like he's a leader on a stage far, far, far away, but an actual human that I can talk to and that I can relate to, and is a fun guy. And being in elections lately have felt a lot like you're voting out of fear, you're voting because you're scared or something, and it's nice to just have like fun and enjoy an election and actually care about something and something be genuine.
Chris, you had one last word to offer?
Yeah, I mean, Ellie is 100% right, which is kind of my new catchphrase these days. And at the end of the day, like the most successful lefty movements have been not just political parties, but they've been political movements, right? And so what you're seeing from doubling down on that authenticity, being where people are that other leaders can't necessarily play in authentically, is a bit of a, I see you, I see where you are, and you see me, and together we can actually form a bit of a community. And so when I was talking a bit about sort of driving that wedge of, you know, us versus them, what this is them creating the us, right? Like if you look at how Jagmeet speaks in that video, you see, you know, it's casual, it is vernacular, it is, you know, you see yourself represented in that guy, and texting, here, let me share something about my life with you, and back. So that is a strong emotional community connection to create that us that then is contrasted against the them. So that's the last little bit of this campaign that we need to nail is we're creating the us. Now let's go against the them.
You know, learning something new continues to be the greatest experience in life. Listen, I want to thank you all. We could have gone on lots more. We had lots more that we planned to talk about, but we just kind of got caught up with the conversation. It was terrific, really, really good today. So I want to thank you all. Those who tuned in, thank you so much. And we didn't get to your questions, I know, as much as we should have. But what we'll do, we'll answer them directly. Count on that. We're back next week to our regular time schedule, which is Wednesday at noon. So please join us again for the run up to the final stretch. So with that, take care all and be safe.